broken VCR. It would have been 1993, I think. I was working for a company that manufactured computers and equipment that was being used in food factories, mostly chicken factories. They did things like weighing chickens on production lines, grading systems, and box end labelling. Boxes of chickens would be weighed, a product code would be entered, and the label could be printed. And the data would go back to a central server, which was mainly Unix, AIX, and later SCO Xenix and SCO Unix, which probably just sounds like double Dutch to most people. It wasn't Windows anyway. So my first job at the company, I got a job working in the production department. It was quite strange. The job that was advertised was a computer engineer, but that job had gone. And it was only when I'd been with the company several years I realised that the job that was advertised I didn't actually get. So essentially what happened, 50 people applied for the job, and it was whittled down to two, me and another guy, who will remain nameless. Not for any particular reason, but yeah, I think it's only fair. So we both interviewed together, and we had a technical interview in the production department. It was quite strange because we were actually replacing somebody who was in the production department, and they had to move the stuff so that we could sit down and do a soldering test. If memory serves me well, it was a soldering test. And I had done soldering in school, and I'd burnt my finger quite a few times, quite badly. Putting the soldering iron back, oddly enough, because some of the kids didn't let it cool down before they put it away. I still remember the noise of burning flesh and the smell. So it was a soldering test, and I think I passed it because I did eventually get the role, and so did the guy who was interviewing with me. The two of us got a role in the production department, so there was obviously two roles to replace one. The soldering test wasn't a huge success. Apparently I'd soldered the components on all backwards. I suppose in that regard, it was consistent. But hey, they still give me a job, and I can't really complain about that. It was quite low paid. Technically not my first job after college. I'd done something else. That can be that'd be something for another day, that episode, I think. So I started with this company, and for the first year I was working in the production department, which involved manufacturing. Basically the soldering and a lot of that work was done by contractors, and we got the circuit boards and we would test them and we would put them together and we would run through a series of checks. And that was it. It was pretty mundane work, but yeah, I'd like to say it paid the bills, but the money was pretty rubbish. About a year in to doing this, well, every so often we'd have the opportunity to go to site with a service engineer, and I was a single man. The other guy wasn't. He was about to be married. He had a child on the way, so I used to go out on these shall we say, adventures. They were usually pretty rubbish, but it was an experience, and you got experience of chicken factories and these weighing systems, so it wasn't too bad. So this particular day, there was a requirement for one of us to go to Northern Ireland to it was actually a bovine factory in the north of Ireland. Now I was happy to go. It meant flying out from Manchester to Belfast International, Belfast Aldergrove, and there was already two engineers, maybe even three actually, already there, but they needed assistance. So my colleague, he obviously felt a bit guilty, and he turned to me and said, "Listen, you know what? You've been doing all these jobs. I'll go do this. I'll go to Northern Ireland. I'll go and help the guys out." He was a little bit stressed over the whole thing. He wasn't a big traveller. I think he was quite a nervous flyer. I do remember he put his tools that he'd think he'd need for the job in a carrier bag. I'm not quite sure how that works these days now with hand luggage and tools, which probably involved cutters and tie wraps. But in those days, Maybe it was simpler times. So he went off to do that. It was Friday afternoon. He left about 2 o'clock in the day to go to the airport. And I was left on my own in the production department. For whatever reason, my manager wasn't there. And I was there. And I was watching the clock. It was Friday afternoon, maybe 4 o'clock. I was waiting for 5 o'clock. Waiting and wishing for it. There was nothing to do. And I couldn't wait to go home. And then about 4:45, one of the software managers came down the stairs to me and said, "Jason, you've written software before, haven't you?" I said, "Well, I did a bit of Pascal in college on apricots. I'd actually been very good at it. But in those days, there didn't seem to be that many software coding jobs, certainly not where I was living." So he says, "Come with me, I'd like to have a chat with you." So essentially he showed me the language that he needed someone to code in. He said he had a glut for 2 weeks. He needed someone for 2 weeks to help out writing software. The software was a 4GL called Sculptor, and he'd known that it was on my CV, I think. I'm not quite sure about that. I'm not quite sure if whoever had been sitting there that day would have been asked, but it was me that was asked. And for me, that was the start of where I am today, the secret of my success. So for a year, maybe nearly 2, I was doing software. It was more than 2 weeks. I'd like to say I was brilliant at it. I was very good technically, but lacked, obviously, the real-world experience. So sometimes when I wrote software, it would work fantastic, in the development type environment. But when I went out into the field, it was woeful. But that was a good lesson. Failure is a good lesson. So the Holy Grail, the best paid jobs, the jobs that came with a company car and a mobile phone in the company, the ones that, you wanted the salary and the trinkets, was the service engineer's job. And a job came up, a position came up, and I decided I'd go for it. And so did my colleague, who'd been working in the production department. And the process took some time before the person was chosen. But in the meantime, the managing director, one lunchtime, I happened to be sitting in production on my own. I seem to have been sitting in production quite a lot on my own, but I don't believe it was like that. But anyway, he came into production at lunchtime with his video recorder, his video cassette recorder, his VCR. And he brought it in and he said, "Jason," actually I don't even know if he knew my name. I'd like to think he did. He said, "Jason, my video recorder stopped working. Could you have a look?" I said, "I'll have a look." Now, bearing in mind my video recorder repair skills were pretty much close to zero, but I had a look at it anyway. And as luck would have it, there was a tiny little fuse on the circuit board. And I was able to use a meter and realise that the fuse had blown, and I replaced it. And I fixed his VCR. I fixed the managing director's VCR. And he was very, very pleased. I'm not sure if he was a frugal man, but in those days, video cassette recorders were quite expensive. And yeah, he was very, very happy. So when the time came to select a service engineer, well, I got the role. And I can't help thinking it was because, well, I fixed his VCR was probably the main reason. But also, that Friday afternoon, on my own, in the production department,